The following podcast was produced in-house for KQEK.com. This is Mark R. Hasan, and welcome to KQEK.com's podcast channel, available from iTunes, Libsyn, Google Play, and YouTube. Today's program features a chat with film composer Joe Kraemer regarding his music for Amazon's original 6-episode series, Comrade Detective. I actually find it hard to believe 17 years have passed since I first listened to Joe Kraemer's fun and candid composer commentary track that accompanied the isolated score on the DVD of Way of the Gun. His feature film breakthrough, directed by Christopher McQuarrie, future director of Jack Reacher and Mission Impossible 5, Rogue Nation, two films that also feature scores composed by Kraemer. The two are personal favorites because they're unusually rich orchestral works that also show the maturity and complexity of his writing, as well as an affection for the thematic writing of the 1970s, a period film fans and film music fans collectively admire for the creative gambles in visual, directorial, and musical storytelling. In our conversation, we touch upon his latest work, the instant cult series Comrade Detective, a satire of Soviet-era genre knockoffs, and King Cohen, a new documentary on indie filmmaker Larry Cohen, himself a unique voice who's worked with some of film music's most iconic composers and talents, including Bernard Herrmann, Miklos Rozsa, Frank Cordell, Robert O. Ragland, Gil Millay, and the James Brown. Also discussed our audio commentaries on DVDs and vinyl, but the real focus is crafting nuances for satire, a special genre that's easy to bungle if the scoring approach is not done with special care. There may not be hardcore rules in tackling the genre, but as a viewer, you know when it's done right, which is the case with Comrade Detective, an original Amazon production which for the time being isn't available on home video. Before we dissolve to our discussion, might I suggest hanging around after our chat for some personal thoughts on why Canadians may well relish the series a bit more than American viewers. There's a correlation between this fake Soviet propaganda series set in 1983 and actual 1980s detective series shot in Canada, sold internationally, and viewed by millions of Americans as shows that seemed a little odd, set in any city U.S.A. but feeling different from more familiar network fodder. Also in the wrap-up are some details on another upcoming podcast tied to Video Store Day on Saturday, October 21st, and the recently announced end-of-year closure of VideoFlix. And now let's travel to 1983 Romania, where Detective Gregor Angel and Iosif Baciu are trying to solve the murder of a fellow Bucharest officer killed by a sniper wearing a Ronald Reagan mask. How did you get involved with the show? Because it's a really interesting, unusual show, especially since it's a limited episode run.
Yeah, it was. It was really interesting. I first heard about the show sort of through the grapevine of different agents and composers were talking about the show and what a weird concept it was. I was a fan of a couple of British TV shows that were made in a similar vein. The first one that came to mind was an old show called Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, which you can find on YouTube, and it's really weird and funny, and it's a similar idea of a show from the 80s that's been lost and recovered. So when I heard about this show, I was definitely into the idea of a pretend sort of lost classic. And then the other thing I like about it was because of the time period, I was really interested because it meant I wouldn't have to use a lot of synthesizers and do sort of the modern type of film scoring, which is very drony and tonal, and instead do thematic music that used real instruments, which whenever I get a chance to do that, I'm always up for it.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that it had a large orchestra because I actually expected it to have some synthetic, if not heavy synthetic elements.
The two ways they could have scored the show, because it took place in, the early 80s, was with retro, like analog synths, or with live players, because that's how they did television in that era. And I think before I was involved with the process, they tried a couple of synth tracks from, old John Carpenter movies or maybe Miami Vice, and it just didn't work. It didn't mesh with the look of the show, which is, Romania, which is very classic architecture. It's old world feeling, rather than, say, Miami Vice, where it felt much more contemporary when it was being made, with the neon lights and all the sort of modern architecture. This show has very classic architecture, very classic costumes and locations, and the live instruments seem to be a better fit. And it wasn't necessarily as large an orchestra as it sounds. I have learned a few tricks over the years to make a smaller group sound bigger, so that was also fun to play with.
Well, I also noticed that the score, it doesn't specifically reference a geographic area. It doesn't reference a very specific time period either. And I think that actually helps the show a great deal, because it's got such a strange sense of humor that I get the feeling that for the writers, for the actors, for the directors, and especially for the composer, there's a really, really fine line that you have to walk, because if you stray too far, it then becomes too serious and it goes against it. But if you stray too far to the other direction, then you start to make fun of it. And I think everybody was not trying to ridicule it, because the performances are really good.
Yeah, it's not a spoof, it's a satire. The word satire has sort of gotten muddled through the years by Mad Magazine and Saturday Night Live, but a proper satire isn't necessarily funny, laugh out loud funny. It's humorous and ironic, but isn't always a spoof. And to do the music, what I actually did, I don't know if the director took it this far or the writers took it this far, but I actually sort of imagined that I was a Romanian composer in 1983, being ordered by the Communist Party to write music for this propaganda piece to, convince the citizens of the country that America was evil. And in a sense, I was acting as the composer. I was putting on a performance with the score that I imagined the composer in that era would have wanted to imitate and emulate American movies, yet at the same time not undermine the communist message of the show. So there are elements of Romanian music in there, like a zither and other sort of percussive instruments. And the concertmaster of the orchestra was from Romania, and he sort of threw in little gestures occasionally on the violin that had a Romanian flavor to them. So it's this merging of this idea of a 80s Romanian composer wanting to sort of do the big Hollywood thing, yet at the same time being compelled to promote a communist agenda, which is where a lot of the sort of ironic placement of the Star Spangled Banner and America the Beautiful and Hail to the Chief, those sort of musical phrases from those pieces of music crop up in sort of critical ways when the show is making a comment about America.
I think a younger audience will enjoy it and will probably get most of the references, but I think an older audience, because for myself, I'm 49, there's a lot of little tiny subtle comments and sort of names that are dropped during the course of the episodes, which I find hysterical. And it really does feel like a, kind of a very earnest communist propaganda spin on the American detective show.
Well, it's interesting to me as well. For me, the film, working on it was different than it is for you because I never received the English version. I scored the whole thing to a Romanian version with subtitles. And now I knew that they were going to be dubbing it into English, but I still haven't seen most of it with the English language. So I heard the actors' real voices and then had English subtitles over Romanian dialogue. So it was even easier to sort of suspend my disbelief and really score the thing, like a proper Romanian composer might in terms of the agenda of the message of the show. And like you say, both in the dialogue and in the music, I tried to drop in musical gestures or phrases that hopefully there'll be someone in the audience who will pick up on them, whether it's the national anthem, there's little bits of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony sprinkled throughout, things like that I hope will hint at maybe pop culture references for the audience.
Did each episode, for example, require an unusually larger amount of music? Because there is quite a bit of score in each episode.
It is pretty heavily scored, you're right. It was definitely more than I thought when we first started talking about the show, but as I kept going, I realized, it kind of needed it. It felt like it needed it in order to, I guess, paint the picture that we were trying to paint. The director, Rhys Thomas, often spoke about what he called sound worlds. And the music obviously is a huge part of that. It's half of the sound. And the spell that we were trying to cast with the music and sound effects, and also with the songs that were put in the show, ended up being a much larger undertaking than we all first thought. But, I'm not complaining that I got to write and record more music. That's always fun. I've heard a rumor that they want to do possibly an album that's, some of the 80s songs mixed in with some of the score. And then there's also interest in doing a score-only album. Nothing has been officially released yet or announced. But as soon as I know, certainly I'll be spreading the word on social media.
I'm curious if your experience with the Mission Impossible series, and as well especially Jack Reacher, have been two films that kind of helped you develop a very specific, refined sound to scoring, action, and tension. Jack Reacher is one of my favorites because the music it's sort of always this undercurrent, and then it just kind of eases back, just as though there's some kind of big action explosion, making room perhaps for sound effects, but also just setting the audience up for whatever visually and sonically is going to sort of explode in front of them. And I like that sort of unsettling undercurrent that really was heavy in Jack Reacher. Whereas in Mission Impossible 5, there's some great action cues in there, very, very robust cues, but at the same time, there's a lot of refinement to them. They're not heavy, bombastic cues, and I think you definitely hear that as well in Comrade Detective, where everything is very strategic, very refined, and I wonder how much those two films played a part in your development in scoring, action, and especially suspense.
We're always on a continuum, hopefully, of growth and expansion and refinement. And from my very first feature that got widespread release, which was The Way of the Gun back in 2000, I've been sort of chipping away at this style of writing that has become retro. Now, I never set out to be a maverick or a retro composer, but I've always loved, I'm like you were saying, you're 49, I'm 46, and I grew up on a lot of the films of the 70s, either seeing them in the theater or seeing them on cable on Saturday afternoons. And the style of scoring up until about the mid 80s, when the Bruckheimer aesthetic sort of came into Hollywood. Up until that point, the style of scoring tended to be thematic and motivic, and the composers tended to be conservatorially educated at Juilliard or different music schools. And somewhere in the mid 80s, rock stars started coming in and doing film music instead. And that became the voice of film music. And I think that's totally valid. There's room for all types of music in movies. But I've always preferred that more classical and jazz type approach of melody and counterpoint and line writing and voicing chords in a way that is more classic than rock and roll. And I think maybe that's what's coming through in the work for those films that you mentioned. Certainly in Jack Reacher, the aesthetic was to build up to action sequences and then let the sound design take over. And there was some effort by the director to carry that aesthetic through into Mission Impossible. But we soon discovered, and Tom was actually a big proponent of this, that when the action kicks in, we can't take the music away. We have to keep going. And so I was given an opportunity finally to write action music for action sequences. And I did my best to maintain that sort of John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith approach of thematic underscoring rather than just, as you say, bombast.
I think Mission Impossible 5 is one of my favorite action scores because it has also a special elegance and grandeur to it, but it's also very kinetic, and there's some great incorporation of sort of Middle Eastern aspects in there as well. But I wonder, have you heard of a composer named Michael Small? And I wonder if you're familiar with any of his work, because there's a little, like Jack Reacher to some degree also reminds me of some of those 1970s scores that you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was just flying overseas and I watched Clute on the plane, which was scored by Michael Small. And yeah, I'm familiar with his work. Also, David Shire, who did All the President's Men. He was a huge influence on me. And you can hear fingerprints of those scores in Way of the Gun and Jack Reacher, from All the President's Men, Taking of Pelham 123, The Conversation. All of the films that we're talking about, like Coppola, Alan Pakula, these were all like tight, tense thrillers that didn't necessarily use a lot of music, but when they did use music, it really counted. And that's something I'm always trying to do, is to not just do wallpaper, but to really make the music count when it's there. So, for better or worse, in terms of, fitting in with the landscape of contemporary filmmaking, that's the approach that I've chosen.
And I just wondered if I could talk a little bit about Way the Gun, because that's definitely one of the first scores that I heard that you composed, and also it was one of the early DVDs that featured both an isolated score track and a composer commentary track, something that has become extremely rare in the last while. But for a while, it seemed that they made a point of getting the composers to talk about their score, and it was great fun to actually listen to thoughts on, how they scored the piece, and then you'd actually hear the piece, then reflections on that, and then how they would tie it to other stuff. Have you had any further attempts to do a commentary track, and have you found that what may have sort of caused that to disappear in favor of the standard commentary and writer commentary?
Well, I did a commentary track for Reacher, and they neglected to even mention it on the box. So, I guess I took that a little personally. I was invited to do a commentary for Mission Impossible, but there's so much music in the movie. There wasn't enough empty space between the tracks, I felt, to make any meaningful comment. There were also bits of the score of Mission Impossible that the director moved around without consulting me. And while I have no problem with that, I also didn't necessarily want to do an isolated score that highlighted that. Instead, I thought the soundtrack album would be a better presentation of the music on its own. I'm definitely open to doing it more. I enjoy it, and I certainly, it doesn't take much to get me to talk about myself. It's just a question, I guess, of the right fit with the right project. And again, with Mission Impossible, between the edits that were made to the music and the lack of time to contribute a meaningful commentary, that score was not isolated. Instead, we did a featurette about the music, but then in typical sort of Hollywood fashion, they made different versions of the DVD and Blu-ray for different markets, and you could only get the featurettes. I think in America, you can only get them from Target. So I don't know what the availability of those featurettes will be in future editions of the film or box sets. Hopefully they'll get out there and be more available to more people. But we did manage to put some nice bits of insight about the score into these featurettes on the Target edition of the Blu-ray. And like I said, in the future, I'm definitely open to doing it. I guess the other consideration is that the people who make the soundtrack album, they're not always crazy about the fact that there's an isolated score on the DVD. So that's a practical concern because CD sales are so anemic these days that I want to do everything I can to help support anyone who wants to release one of my scores on CD.
I've just got two quick questions to close up. One of them is just, do you have any thoughts on soundtracks that are being either reissued on vinyl or coming out both on CD, digital, and vinyl as well?
Yeah, I think any format that gets people to invest in music is great. I love Napster when it came out, and I love the convenience of internet trading with music and all that stuff, but it's a machine that can't operate without income. So the practicality of investing in vinyl, I think, is great. I also like high-res audio, and I think, all music, I think it's great when music's available on vinyl, available on iTunes, CD, and then also like HD tracks or the Pono player, a high-res format. I wanted to do a vinyl for Mission 5, and I know Cruise was into it, but Paramount just kind of shut it down and never let it happen, which was a disappointment to me. But, I have no control over it because at the end of the day, I don't actually own the scores I write for these big movies.
And then my last question is just for a more recent project that you've done, King Cohen, the world of filmmaker Larry Cohen.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk just briefly about what that project consisted of and what it was like to score a documentary, especially one for such a colorful, legendary character.
Documentaries are fun. I've done a few of them. I did one about Ralph Nader, and I did another one about the fall of communism in Poland and contributions that I think it was Pope John Paul made to that. So I've done a number of these historical documentaries, and what's fun about them is that you can sort of score character and history, but you're not sort of so tied into the editing the way you are in a feature, so that you have to sort of jump through hoops musically to catch cuts. With a documentary, it's much more about the tone and the flavor. King Cohen was great because Larry is just such a crazy guy, and he's got so many great stories, and his movies are so quirky and off the wall. The challenge of the film was finding a balance between scoring the character, if you will, of Larry Cohen and the other sort of practical aspect of scoring a documentary about a filmmaker, which is that you're constantly dancing around film clips that are included in the documentary that have music of their own. So, you might show 5 seconds and you're hearing Bernard Herrmann from It's Alive. And then we cut to something else, Larry talking about the movie, and there's no Bernard Herrmann there. So do I fill that space with sort of pseudo Bernard Herrmann music, or do I rather write something that has nothing to do with Bernard Herrmann that scores the clip of Larry? And we sort of dealt with that on a case-by-case basis. So that was sort of the big technical challenge of doing that film. But it's a lot of fun, and I'm actually really proud of it. It's made by the guys who run La La Land Records, who I've done a number of soundtrack albums with. So it was gratifying to move into filmmaking with them and not just sort of commercial soundtrack work.
Well, I've noticed what La La Land has done over the last while is they've reissued not just sort of classic albums that Film Score Monthly had put out, but also they're clearly going after scores that they loved and influenced them when they were younger, because there's a very specific interest on, for example, Jerry Goldsmith's electronic orchestral combinations, because for a while they came out on CD and LP, but then they were just kind of forgotten. And for myself, they're not among my favorites of his work, but it is nice to see that they are getting their due as sort of expanded, beautifully mastered releases, so that a composer's complete career is neatly represented by very meticulously produced releases.
Yeah, it's really fantastic what they've done, and they've done it with television too. The soundtrack to the original Star Trek series is finally sort of complete, and Mission Impossible, the old Lalo Schifrin scores. They just did, I think, was it Man from U.N.C.L.E.? I think Burlingame just did like a great set of stuff. John Burlingame is a great sort of, he's sort of the Roger Ebert of the film music world. And what's nice is that, you know, in the 80s and 90s, the union rules about soundtrack albums often limited CDs to 28 minutes of music or less. And in the 20 years since those albums were released, they've changed some of the union rules to allow more of the music to be released on CD. And I think that's what's made some of these expanded releases possible. And it's really cool, you know, and especially, you know, like you say, maybe these aren't Goldsmith's touchstone works, but even sort of relatively workaday Goldsmith, I still think is better than most of the people working today. So I'm always delighted to hear a new one of his scores come out.
Now then, you may be wondering where lies the connection between a fake Soviet propaganda series and Canadian shows that also featured cops and detectives. First, a short backstory. Although Canada's made fine teleplay series and miniseries, witness the Emmy Award-winning The Handmaid's Tale based on Margaret Atwood's classic dystopian novel, our roots in producing TV series is much younger than the U.S., and in following the co-production playbook of feature films, we naturally ported ideas into television with the aim of selling shows to international markets. Not unlike the feature films made during the tax shelter years, TV shows were set in any city, U.S.A., and a cluster of series produced during the 1980s were shot in my hometown of Toronto, Ontario. It's Canada's biggest city, but perhaps because it's also an amalgamation of former boroughs, where you live still feels like an urban town that happens to be networked to the downtown core through highways, transit lines, and summer construction projects. There were two types of distinct series being made during the 1980s and early 1990s. Crime shows focusing separately on serious and light content, and series derived from cult films and movie franchises which had guaranteed audiences. Friday the 13th, the series, and War of the Worlds were known for being exceptionally gory and pissing off conservative tightwads, upset that images of human brains, killer hearing aids, and sundry nonsense were being aired between 8 to 10 p.m. when kiddies were still awake, whereas Poltergeist the Legacy tackled more occult happenings, and The Hunger mixed horror and a little bit of erotica. La Femme Nikita starred Peta Wilson, and its makers produced enough episodes to create 5 separate seasons. The 2010 show was similarly shot in Toronto. Remakes of classic TV series include Alfred Hitchcock Presents and The Outer Limits, and more comedic detective shows included the investigative couple series Diamonds, riffing Heart to Heart, and Sweating Bullets, otherwise known as Tropical Heat, one of the most ridiculously titled series which made Nick Slaughter actor Rob Stewart a star in Serbia, resulting in the 2012 documentary Slaughter Nick for President. Carl Weathers also starred as Vietnam vet Adam Boudreau in the action show Street Justice, and I've one slight anecdote tied to that show. When my graduate film was being mixed at Soundhouse in 1991, I remember the mixers joking about Street Justice because the plot holes and lapses in logic were often fixed with overdubbing. Counter-Strike with Christopher Plummer and Simon McCorkindale was another multi-season show in which evil was fought by a rich guy and skilled minions. But the real gem I'm finally getting to is Night Heat, whose place in TV history is in being the first Canadian show to be broadcast by an American network. The detective series was also given a unique spin with Forever Night, featuring Geraint Wyn Davies as a cop who happened to be a vampire, a concept previously tried out in the aborted feature-length teleplay Nick Night starring Rick Springfield. CBS Late Night featured a peculiar collection of rotating Canadian-made shows at 11:30 p.m. Fly By Night was another short variant, but clearly the success of Night Heat kept the show alive for 4 solid seasons. Truth be told, I've only seen a few episodes, but it was a show with a glossy urban feel shot almost exclusively at night with a vibrant percussive score and evil corkscrew theme song by rocker Dominic Troiano. The show balanced gunfire and car chase actions with some buddy-buddy humor, and the cops had their long-suffering girlfriends during the show's unusually long run. So how does all of this relate to Comrade Detective? Well, like Soviet and East Bloc nations, there was logic in making our own version of the American Detective series. But instead of political propaganda and characters set in their own local large cities, we created a type of series that, not dissimilar to Comrade Detective, was a bit tongue-in-cheek. Maybe not overt or even subtle satire, but if you move ahead a few years to 1994, you get Due South, the Paul Haggis series in which a Canadian Mountie played by Paul Gross worked with a Chicago beat cop and, with his trusty wolf Diefenbaker, helped solve local and international tinged crimes over 4 seasons. The difference between Night Heat and Due South is obvious. Haggis and Gross's series was a complete send-up of the detective genre, and more specifically, those Canadian knockoffs that had recently preceded it. Never mind that the wolf was named after our 13th Prime Minister. There was minimal effort by the production to hide Toronto's identity. Instead of filming at night to hide our red and black streetcars, buses, transit signs, city paper boxes, and Instabank machines, they were frequently seen in the background, and in one hysterical sight gag, a camera held a bit longer on a bumper sticker that read, "My Canada includes Quebec," a political reference to the referendum slogan by the Stay in Canada side when Quebec held its second historic and disruptive referendum to separate from Canada and become its own country. The winning vote to keep Canada intact was won by a margin of 50 plus 1%, a number we locally call the Quebec vote. All 3 aforementioned series, Comrade Detective, Night Heat, and Due South, feature ongoing frictions between initially ill-matched partners, suffering girlfriends and/or wives, or ex-wives, bureaucratic headaches, tracking down seedy, scummy crooks and killers, the weariness of the job, and goofball colleagues whom at some point had specific episodic moments to transcend their comedy relief archetypes and do proper investigative policing before returning to their goofball states. Now, you could argue that, like Comrade Detective's design as satirical propaganda, our variants were stealth genre propaganda, almost real cop shows that looked and sounded like Chicago and New York action suspense dramas, but in reality were filmed for the most part in my hometown in its pre-condofication state. To Canadians of a specific age, Comrade Detective evokes a bit of our own detective shows precisely because we beat Amazon's show by several decades, making what could be branded as genre propaganda that looked and sounded American, but certainly in the case of Due South, took political and cultural potshots and jabs at formulaic cliches. Americans may have felt these shows were just odd, amusing, or worked wonders during a bout of insomnia, but north of the 49th parallel, we could always tell when a show was Canadian. Not because it lacked quality, well, maybe with Counter-Strike and Street Justice, but because of the eerily familiar locations that were frequently rebooked by separate series. A particular church on the Danforth seemed to reappear in Friday the 13th, a heck of a lot, as did a show house for a custom upscale home development north of the city, which I swear is the same house that was used by my classmate in university. As I mentioned in my review of Comrade Detective at KQEK.com, the show's makers chose to film the series digitally and in widescreen, opting for locations, decor, cast, music, and color to sell the image of a vintage series instead of actually shooting on film with grain and grit from the chemical processing. The Canadian shows were done with special attention to economy, and In Vogue at the time was shooting on film but posting the series on video, so you'll notice many of these series have a very strange look. It's film, but the colors are a kind of digital, with freakishly saturated greens and reds and purples. Local labs became experts at extracting visual production value by boosting colors using the elite Da Vinci suite, resulting in chroma greens and reds that today accentuate loud 80s fashion and decor. The oversaturated colors and the glow radiating from anything yellow or chrome-based may have been a way to add a sheen or fake network gloss to these productions, but if one were to create a lost Canadian genre knockoff, the mandatory look would be the polar opposite of the desaturated colors of Comrade Detective. Where locations in the faux commie series emphasized grit in the Romanian workers' paradise, the urban paradise we sold Americans had working-class men and women decked or drecked out in style, because culturally that's what Night Heat's producers expected would sell in the United States. They were, of course, right, because CBS Late Night also embraced Due South as well. Setting aside the satirical links between these series, what also ties them together is a design to meet the demands of programmers. Amazon's show is original and enables the merchant behemoth to build up a catalog of shows that look, sound, and work just like network and cable series. And all of the aforementioned Canadian productions fulfilled dual goals. meeting the international need for American-style programming that looked and sounded like traditional network series with new and aging stars, and allow Canadian broadcasters to fulfill minimum Canadian content or CanCon requirements so the bureaucrats could stop complaining about the dearth of local programming. Most of these shows may sound utterly disposable as banal genre entries, but they did result in a huge production boom that's responsible for the fine cast and crews in Toronto, and its many creative technicians that founded service businesses on their own. The boom went a little bust in the late 1990s when series and TV movies started to dry up, but as The Handmaid's Tale exemplifies, we're still a major production hub. But while new shows do get digital and disc releases, not all classic shows like Due South have enjoyed home video editions. Love it or hate it, Night Heat never made it to disc because its design and financial success made it a failure in the eyes of snooty Canadian critics. In their eyes, it's dated and forgettable and an echo of authentic and bitter American detective shows, whose makers didn't try so hard to make a commercial product because it just came naturally. Now, you could argue some of these CanCon shows were earnest, but whereas the cited horror and sci-fi shows guarantees a cult status among genre fans, who wants to own a cop show primarily seen by American insomniacs and shift workers, and one that Canada's CTV network aired endlessly to pad out those minimum Canadian content broadcast rules? Technically, the challenge to master a show like Night Heat for DVD is more complex, and may be similar to Paramount's dilemma with Star Trek The New Generation, which had early digital video effects and had a similar shot-on-film but posted-on-video look. DVD sets of Friday the 13th and the cult cable TV series The Hitchhiker have disclaimers about source materials being not great, so there's a warped irony in which Comrade Detectives creators were able to craft a fake vintage series with future-proofed HD production values, but the real things mandate special technical challenges to get them up to contemporary broadcast and home video standards. I doubt there's even an awareness of Night Heat by nostalgia mining labels such as Shout Factory, but I do wonder how the show would be received by American viewers if it was billed as a true lost form of genre propaganda, actually restored from its fragile video masters and presented as is, with no cheeky introductions, commentary, or overdubbing every time someone says roof instead of roof. Just present our version of what we thought a detective series should be, with stealth Canuckle values tucked in, or as an artifact with accidental Canadianisms that may have come from stealth-minded writers, accidental insertion due to forgetfulness, or a tight production schedule and too many night shoots and cold coffee and yesterday's donuts. As we finally come to the end of this unusually verbose podcast wrap-up, a few quick closing remarks and details on the next podcast. First, special thanks to Joe Kraemer for his generous time, and Adrianna Perez and McIsaac at White Bear PR for facilitating this interview. A review of Comrade Detective Season 1 is available at KQEK.com. I've made a point to avoid detailing some of the best jokes, plot twists, and the show's character arcs because the twists and turns are part of the series' fun. My next podcast will directly tie into the upcoming Video Store Day, which occurs at bricks and mortar stores near you on Saturday, October 21st. Back in May of 2016, I Lost It at the Video Store author Tom Roston and Now Magazine senior film writer Norm Wilner discussed the history and current status of the once plentiful video store. And although Part 1 has been available in a prior podcast from KQEK.com, Part 2's contents feature more interaction with the audience that came to hear the two talk at Toronto's Bay Street Video. I've edited and cleaned up the location audio, and this segment will be bookended with personal thoughts on the value and survival of Video Store Day, as each year seems to signal another shop's closing. Ironically, September has yielded the gradual closure of another iconic shop. For roughly the past 2 weeks, residents around Avenue Road and Lawrence have been aware that VideoFlix will close at the end of 2017, and the neighborhood and city will lose what's perhaps the oldest video store in Toronto, having been established in 1981. I'll have more thoughts on the closure and what it may signal for the city in the next podcast, and further details on how you'll be able to see my experimental documentary, BSV 1172, Your Friendly Neighborhood Video Store, which screened at the 2016 San Diego Underground Film Festival and at the 2017 iMyth Film Festival in Toronto. The short will be released digitally, and maybe physically, with a bevy of unique special features in early 2018. And to salute Video Store Day, I'll make the film available for viewing close to and including the weekend of October 21st for free. This podcast is available via iTunes, Libsyn, Google Play, and YouTube, and is copyrighted 2017 by Mark R. Hasan. Visit KQEK.com for recent film and disc reviews, and its substantive review archive packed with classic, contemporary, weird, and exploitation titles. Thanks for listening.